going to deal with certain inquiries put forward to you by the ICO, for example, or if you're going for ISO 27001 certification or other frameworks alike. So as we go through, the session is broken down into a couple of small key points. So to begin with, it's going to be an introduction to what CyberComply actually is. We will then go through who it's aimed at, so essentially more the types of people that we find utilising the tool. So if you are using this webinar as a scope and opportunity to understand who in your business is going to be best suited to using something like this, we'll cover that type of thing off. We'll then go through some more of the unique selling points, some of the features and benefits of what CyberComply has to offer you, and then we'll end on a Q&A session. As we go through, you are more than welcome to, go to Webinar Essential calls it raising your hand to ask any questions. We do try to keep an eye on them as we go through the session. If we don't, then try and make them as specific as possible so that when we get to the end, we can try and answer them as quickly as possible for you. So going on to what CyberComply is. CyberComply was essentially the brainchild of Vigilant Software, and we've been able to pull on a number of different resources, both from our parent group and due to our length of time in the industry. CyberComply is ultimately a cloud-based solution, so that it essentially makes it a lot easier for people to log in from wherever they need to. We understand nowadays that people either work remotely, either using their own machines, work machines, etc. So utilizing the cloud to its ultimate ability to facilitate those sort of environments for our customers. It also allows us to work in much more of a fluid state in the fact that if we are receiving multiple feedback on things like that, or types of support queries, we're able to respond to them in a much quicker manner, in the fact that we can push updates out and know that it's going to affect our entire client base, as opposed to having multiple different people on different platforms running different versions, etc. So the CyberComply platform has been designed to do a number of things. If you're familiar with our pricing module or the commercial aspect of it, this might be a little bit redundant, but essentially what we try to do is build the tool to be scalable. So if you're a very small organization, we offer monthly and annual billing prices, both for a single user perspective. So if you're part of a small team, for example, then that will be best suited to you. But we've also been able to scale the platform to allow for multiple users to simultaneously be logged in, working on the projects as a whole all together, so there's no logging in, logging out, or treading on anyone's toes. The whole system is live, so whatever you're seeing in front of you is what the last person is currently working on as well. We've built the tool to be repeatable for frequent risk assessments, not just risks themselves, but also if you're looking at things like data protection impact assessments, just general workflow really. The point of using a tool such as CyberComply in this type of project is to ensure that what you're doing is in both a uniformed and collaborative manner. The reduced variability is also part of that uniformed way of looking at how you're going to work through this. So there's no one person does it in one way, one person does it in a different way. The result at the end might be slightly different because obviously the different types of projects you're working on, but how you got there is going to be done in the same manner. It's particularly helpful for if you're going to be trying to show evidence to certification bodies, or if you're trying to illustrate how you got to your findings to people like the Information Commissioner's offices as well. If we skip through the next point and go down to maintainable, what we tried to introduce into CyberComply was a way for multiple stakeholders to work on a project, as we've already mentioned. But in addition to the general group of people that work on a project, ranging from your data protection officers all the way through to your information security managers, CISOs, etc. You do also have the ability to invite an unlimited number of read-only, so it's a very easy way to bring on your senior management, some other key members of the organization that aren't necessarily involved in the project but may need to have an overview. So it's maintainable in the fact that you can have multiple people viewing the project as it goes through. The last point on here is to have everything you need in one place for governance. The CyberComply platform has evolved over time. So it originally started as just a risk management platform, and it wasn't even cloud-based at the time. We then started to evolve into other areas to do with GDPR management, so looking at data flow mapping to satisfy the need for Article 30. Or the requirements for Article 30. We then, off the back of that, introduced the Data Protection Impact Assessment tool. So it's a way of helping an organisation very quickly understand if the DPIA needs to be conducted, therefore saving a bit of time, not creating work for yourselves that doesn't need to be there. We then have one of the core elements of it, which is the Compliance Manager. So the compliance manager ultimately is the access into all of the regulations that CyberComply hosts, from UK laws, DPA 2018, the EU GDPR, and it will also give you access to a number of different frameworks as well. So ISO 27001, there's Cyber Essential frameworks built into the platform, and a number of other areas including PCI, etc. From there, we then branched out a little bit further and understood that some of the key weak points that most businesses were having was not being able to accurately track DSARs with the GDPR, essentially making it free for anybody to request them. They've either become so overburdened by them by not being able to keep track of them, make sure they're sticking within the strict guidelines in which they have to be resolved within. So we put a tracker in for that. We've also introduced breach reporting, which was inherently something that only the IT teams in most organizations would have managed personally themselves. We've now brought it into the platform so that if a breach occurs, it's not just simply logged by one individual team. The entire information team understands as well that, okay, this breach closely related to a particular risk or a particular process that we have in-house, and then we can work through the task system how we're actually going to work to rectify that in the future. So these are the individual offerings. I've gone through them just a second ago. The way that we built CyberComply is that, yes, the entire system works fantastically as a complete suite, so that you can have people from your information security team working on this all the way through to your IT managers, etc. So you can be conducting both a ISO 27001 risk assessment for certification at the same time as just doing your due diligence when it comes to the GDPR requirements as well. Each one can be mixed and matched. So if you're only doing 27001, you only need to have that. If you're only doing data flow mapping, you can only have that. You can bolt them on at later points if you need to. So if you have a smaller team that's going to work through these on a step-by-step basis, you can add them on as and when required. So just to go through each one in a little bit more detail, VS Risk Cloud, it's something that we actually started off right from the very beginning. VS Risk Cloud has been in existence for around 8 to 9 years now. It was originally a desktop variant, and obviously we've already covered off some of the inherent issues that come with it being localized to an individual machines. But ultimately, VS Risk Cloud is there to help with the 27005 element of going for certification, understanding what your organization risks are, how you actually conduct your way in trying to either mitigate a risk, identifying the risk, understanding what you do with these types of environments, and then ultimately giving you the types of reports you're going to need to submit to people like your certification body, internal or external auditors. We also have a document storage support to support control implementation, work procedures and policies, which we'll go through in a little bit more detail. And then we also have the ability to complete both your risk treatment plans and your statements of applicability all within the platform itself without having to take it out and manipulate any further than you need to. The Compliance Manager, as we touched on a second ago, is ultimately designed to help users meet their legal and regulatory requirements. So not only does it give you access to these controls and regulations, it ultimately allows you to use it as both a referencing tool, but more of a checklist if you wanted to. So you could go through each individual article and say, yes, we're complying with that. So you can use it as a relatively entry level into a type of gap analysis, etc., or just simply using it as a reference. The next part is the data flow mapping tool, and the reason why this was created was organizations, whilst they believed that they had their processes down pat, what we tried to help organizations do here was understand how information actually moves through the business itself, who owns certain elements of it, what assets does it come into contact with, how long do they store data. So it's a way of getting a business to really think about the information they hold and what they do with it, who comes into contact with it. It will then allow you to highlight risks when moving data outside of the EEA. So if you're a global organization, you're dealing with a number of, let's say, third parties, for example, then the system will automatically highlight that those third country transfers take place, and it will force a user to then make a decision of do they have the correct standard practices in place, are there derogations that might apply to that particular transfer of information. As we go through, we then have an area for you to store your personal identifiable information records. So this is a clear area where you can create multiple record areas of how long do you store data, who is the owner of that information, what information is actually involved, the type of lawful basis that you may be taking that information on. Is it consent? Is it legitimate interest, etc. And then at the very end of it, you'll end up with a clear and detailed report of process. And so this will outline things like your the scope for the process, the purpose of why the process exists. We will then also have an insight to any sort of technical or organizational measures, and then there's multiple tabs built into the same area where you can link it across to other elements of the platform, which we'll highlight as we go through the insights of CyberComply. The DPIA tool, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially a tool that can be utilized by itself, but it really does benefit from having the data mapping tool bolted on with it. The reason being is if you're identifying what a process is and what type of information is being moved, it's also key to understand the potential risks that might come as part of that as well. So typically with the DPIA, they're relatively long-winded pieces of work for an organization to have to go through. What we've tried to do here is have a system understand within a very short amount of time if the impact assessment even needs to be conducted. The reason for that is that you can go, okay, based on this process, there's not very much that actually goes on with regards to huge amounts of data being dealt with in an automated manner. Therefore, you don't actually need to conduct the assessment. If not, it then takes you through, again, as we've touched on previously, a uniformed manner in which you need to satisfy specific articles within the GDPR and also highlight your risk assessment itself with regards to impact and likelihood scales it will have on the company itself. We will then also be able to easily review and update DPIAs when changes in process and activities occur. So what we mean by that is if you are using the data mapping tool, if you do make a change to the process, it will then almost null and void the DPIA, essentially highlighting the fact that you have made a significant change to the process. Therefore, you may need to now review your DPIA that was originally attached to it. And then lastly, we then have the ability to easily share information with stakeholders and your supervisor or authority through the use of exporting documents directly out of the system, so you can share it with third parties or the ICO or whoever is actually requesting that detail. The GDPR manager is predominantly designed for DPOs, so we'll touch on in just a second who this tool is predominantly aimed at, but DPOs are really the type of people that will be using this. The reason being is it will include a gap analysis tool, so if it's an organization that's new to GDPR, which is slightly surprising with it being so far on now. But if you're a new organization, you're trying to get up to speed with the GDPR, it's a very clear and easy way to understand, okay, where are my weak points? Where do I need to focus a lot of my finance or a lot of my resource to become compliant with that particular area of concern or sort of information security? We then move on into record and report on data breaches. So we touched on it a second ago, and we'll go into more detail. It also incorporates the ability to effortlessly handle DSARs, and then also keep track of your third parties that could potentially be handling your data by the use of questionnaires that we pre-fill in for you or that we've completed for you, and then you can ask your third party to answer. And there's a way of you keeping track, and then you can set tasks to review that within 3, 6, 12 months or whatever the time frame that you wish to have. So the very last section on here is who is it for? Now, these are by no means limited to who can use it. These are the types of titles that we've seen predominantly logging in and making either purchases or actually using the platform moving forward. So if we're looking at right from top to bottom, we have information security officers and managers. We have risk manager, so the job title might vary slightly with there. As we saw a second ago with the GDPR manager, you might be looking at people with the position of a data protection officer. Lead implementer, if you're looking at risk assessments, security consultants, it's a relatively broad title, so it could actually apply to the majority of what CyberComply has to offer. We then have ISMS coordinators, again directly in line with 27001. And then, as you might find with most smaller businesses, that where the titles or the roles in the business may have more varied or shared responsibilities, you might even start to see incorporations of heads of IT managers, but we've mentioned a couple of other titles earlier, so people with the CISO title, CIOs, CTOs, but don't forget you could also be looking at people like your facilities managers, managing directors, or even the CEO if it's a very small organization. So we will leave the slides here, and what we will do is we will move on into the next section of the presentation stage. So the screen will be paused temporarily whilst we go through and launch CyberComply here. Whilst we're having a short intermission, if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to pop them into the questions tab now, we'll review them before we move on, and if not, then we will continue on in just a second. Okay, so no questions have come through just yet. So what we are looking at now, and it should be coming through on the main audience view, is essentially what you'll see as soon as you log into CyberComply. So what we have shown instantly on the home screen is an overview, so a full executive illustration of what the platform has been utilized for so far. So depending on what elements or what modules of CyberComply you're accessing, you will only see the relevant information pertaining to that. The portal that we use for demonstrations, webinars, etc., essentially has access to all modules, which is why this looks a little bit more complex to the one you might be using yourself or the one you're potentially going to be looking to purchase in the future. So the purpose for CyberComply as dashboard is to allow you quick access to any element of CyberComply. So if we want to very quickly view our organizational risks, we can see them right here at the front screen. If we want to keep a keen eye on personal data breaches, that's also available. Overviews of your gap analysis, implementation of security controls. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll then have oversights or overviews of your processes, including groups that may relate to those. We then have contractual requirements, records of data, documentation that we may have stored, and any tasks linking to either breaches, data subject access requests, third parties, or organizational tasks in general. So that could be related to a control, it could be related to a regulation, it could be related to a specific risk. They can also be seen from this point. The main function behind the dashboard is not only for the user to have a quick overview of the project itself, but as most of you will find, presenting this to senior management stakeholders, etc., in a monthly meeting, for example, they don't always want to see the pure nitty-gritty. They might just want to see a quick overview. So that was the main purpose of us creating the dashboard itself. The dashboard can be customized based on the user's requirements, so you can manipulate the dashboard how you want to make it either easier or more relevant to what you're looking at on that particular day, or how you prefer to work in general. The way that you would navigate around the system is by using this drop-down menu at the top here, which have got very clear titles as to what is within each one of them. There are a couple of areas in here that are a shared resource across the platform. So regardless of whether you're a VS Risk customer, whether you're a data flow mapping tool customer, DPIAs, there'll be key elements in here that are accessible to every single module. They will include assets and everything within the group. So assets, asset classes, and PII records. You will also have access into your documents as well as contractual on top of that. The only section in tasks that you'll be able to have as a shared resource is organizational tasks, whereas the other three in here are predominantly part of the GDPR manager itself. So How we tend to go through this is through a step-by-step, so just going down each area and just explaining how each one intertwines with the other. It's not a full how-to guide. We will go through some elements on how to add an asset, how to import, how to conduct a risk assessment, and how to begin a process map as well. So the first area that we'll look at is assets. Now, the asset library can be imported directly from an Excel spreadsheet, so you can use the template we provide to populate that sheet and then import it directly in. So it should speed up the initial migrations, let's say from a more manual process you originally worked on into more of an automated systematic way of working. Alternatively, if you are to create a brand new asset, at the top here, you'll be able to choose asset type. Now, for existing users, just to clarify what this area is, asset type is more to do with the icons on the actual assets themselves. It's not going to be used in a way of filtering or searching, and it's more predominant when you're looking at the data flow mapping tool area, so that you can see from a very quick visual representation of, okay, that's a website, that's a CRM system, that's a mobile device, for example. So if we select on here that we're going to choose it to be a call center today, it will then automatically assign its category. You are able to modify this if you need to. However, we are going to leave it based on the system's recommendation of a system or a service. We'll then go through and give it its reference. So this is what you see it as within the organization. So we're going to see, just say here, call center, Birmingham, for example. Once we have highlighted this information, we can then move into the operator. Now, operator isn't who actually looks after the asset. That's going to be sorted out by the owner. Operator is what they are seen as when it looks at data. So are they a processor? Are they a controller? Is it predominantly yourselves that are going to be looking after it? So in our case, we're going to choose today that it's going to be Vigilant Demo. So it's going to be our organization that is predominantly the operator of this. As we move through, we can see who the owner of this is going to be. So we could say that this is, let's say, sales manager, for example, and then we can ascertain where the location of this is going to be. In our case, because we've pointed out that it's in Birmingham, we're going to say that it is United Kingdom, and it will then automatically put the jurisdiction as it falls within the EEA. We can then outline the classification. So is it seen as a confidential asset? Is it a private, public, restricted? And you do also have the ability to modify a lot of these drop-down menus as well. In our case, we're going to say that it is a private asset. And if we want to link it to a particular asset class, we can do so underneath at this point. The last section we're going to put on here is just going to see call center employed for outbound sales activity. So once we've created the asset, we can select here. It will then pop it in at the very bottom for us. And if we select, it will then give us that core information that we've just entered in. And then you can start to link it across all the other modules within CyberComply itself. So are there any other related assets to this particular part of the business? Are there any notes that we need to add, messages? Do we need to link it to certain documentation, whether that's contracts, etc.? We can see if the asset is going to be, has been used in process maps or it's going to be. We can outline if there's any tasks that might be applicable to this. So let's say we actually have a review process every 3 to 6 months. We actually go through and make sure the assets information is correct in line with either a risk assessment or just with a general due diligence. We can then highlight if there's any contracts pertaining to this specific asset relationship. If there's any legal requirements that this is related to, any controls, and please note that the control note here is simply to say that you implement this control directly on this asset, not necessarily when you're looking at risks themselves. We can then also see if there's any records that relate to this, and this will be an automatically populated area when you go through data flow mapping itself. We can then see if there's any related risks, and then lastly, if there's any documentation that link to this. If we go to one that we predominantly use on these type of presentations and we look at our advisor mobile devices, we'll pull this one into view to begin with. We'll close this off. And another one that we tend to use is our company website, which is located down here. So if we expand on each one, we have that basic information, so the company website, its classification is public, for example, it's a system service, and there's descriptions for each one. We can then also start to see how it ties in with other areas. We can actually see that there are 4 risks that we've identified across our business that are directly linked to this particular asset. We can see there's certain contracts in place. This certain asset is also used in a process of ours, and that we also implement a control specifically to this asset as well. Before we move any further, just to clarify what an asset actually is, it's something of value to the business. Now that can be people, it can be data, it could be intellectual property, or it can even just be physical entities such as desktops, laptops, mobile phones, buildings, servers, etc. So essentially just anything that you see to value. So moving on from the assets individually, we can then do it by asset class as well. Now, this will only be related to to risk assessments, and it's an easier way to conduct the assessment a little bit quicker. So instead of doing your assessment one by one, so saying laptop 1, laptop 2, laptop 3, you can just assign it to the overall group. So if we're looking at it in a perspective of, okay, all of our mobile devices have the same inherent risks. They could all potentially be lost or stolen, etc. A very quick way is just to say, look, this entire group have this same risk. We treat them all in exactly the same manner. We put training into place. We put locks on everything. Everything has encryption at rest, etc., etc. Once you've actually done the group itself, you can then actually link to specific assets if you want to. We can also show if there's any risks that are directly pertaining to that specific asset class as well. So if we're looking at mobile devices, it could be hardware, it could be software, etc. The next section within assets is personal identifiable information records. If we expand on these, what this is going to highlight to you is the classification of the data. So again, is it confidential, is it private? The format in which it's stored, is it text, is it video, is it audio? The recipient, so we've just been very vague and just outlined that it's going to be our managers. We've then got the retention period highlighted here, who the data subjects are, so where's the information coming from, the personal data items we actually handle of theirs, and if there's any sensitive data also handled. We can then highlight within this record the lawful basis that we take the personal data on, and the exceptions for the special categories of data as well. The last section is then going to be your description, and then we can also see at the very bottom here what process maps that this particular record is being used in. So we can see here that yes, it's being used in our client capture process. We can see that there's directly linked assets to this our information team, and then again you've got links to other areas, so you can show if there's any documentation that supports this record, if there's any notes, comments, or history behind it, and then lastly if there's any tasks that you may need to assign to this as well. As we move on, we will then come into an area for contractual. Now, contractual is essentially, as it says on the tin, it allows you to create multiple groups of contracts you might have and then all of their subsets of clauses. So the first one that we have here is policy controls by Vigilant Software Internal, and this is policies to support controls used when mitigating risks, but essentially the contract can be whatever it is. It could be with a third party, for example. If we select on the clause, we can say that yes, part of the contract here is a contract that we have with a third-party LMS provider. We can see the source documentation is linked to off-site, so it's not even just something we can link to inside of CyberComply. We can link to a SharePoint location. We can see how we implement it as a business, the requirements of that particular clause, and then it's effective from and to dates as well. Below there, we then have, again, the same links we've previously had. So what controls are we putting into place on this contract? Are there certain legal requirements that come into play with this? Do we have any tasks that have been assigned, and what is their status? The processes that this also links to, if there's any notes or if there's any history behind it, the number of assets that this could be directly linked to, records, risks, and documents once more. So moving on from the records area and contractual, we're then going to start looking at the breakdown of how the control system works. So controls, like I mentioned, we have a number of them. We have Cyber Essential frameworks. We also have ISO 27001, NIST 853 if you're trying to work to a specific US type of framework. We then have PCI DSS, both the newer and the prior version, and something else we also include is the ability for an organization to upload and store their own organizational controls. So if you're part of a larger group, you'll obviously have your own controls put in place. Maybe you're looking at financial controls, just any type of control that you have, you can upload them into the tool and use them in exactly the same manner that you've seen us do so previously, with showing what controls are being used with contracts, etc. You could have a certain control of your own link into either a control from 27001, a regulation, a specific risk, a process, etc. If we look into 27001 specifically, it's the more common framework, and it's going to become more relevant soon, as the UK educational system is looking to have it so it's a forced implementation across the UK for all schools to implement it. Looking at the controls inside here, we'll be able to see quite a few pieces of relevant information. So if we look at 7.2.2, the reason being is it's one that we've used quite often across the tool. If we expand, we can see what the requirement of the control is, its status. We can see if there's relationships to other controls. We can also highlight here, and this is something that's included in the tool, not something that you will need to do yourselves. We can show how the relationship between 27001 and the EU GDPR or even UK laws is so close-knit. So if you are, let's say you're already certified to 27001, your next project is GDPR, you can look in here and say, well, look, we're implementing this control. These are the other related legal requirements. Based on that kind of status so far, are we already complying with the legal requirements? So it kind of helps you spider web and speed up the compliance or the implementation status both ways. If you want to see more information on any of the drop downs, we have an I button next to each one. So if we look in here, it will give us the law breakdown. We can then mark whether we are compliant, non-compliant, or if it's simply excluded and not applicable to our business model. As we go across, as we saw a second ago, looking at the contract for e-learning, we could see that this was a control that was in place for it. We can see it from the flip side now. So we're looking at the control and we can see the related contract. We can see that there's two tasks on here and one of them is actually overdue. If the control is being used on any processes, again, the notes and comments and history, asset classes it links to, records, what risks are also using the control as an as a mitigating step, and then lastly, if there's any documentation to support that. If you are using this for ISO 27001 implementation, for example, if we use this section here down the bottom and select edit, the minute you use it to mitigate a risk, it will select that box for you. We then have an option to see the business requirement, the contractual requirements and statutory or regulatory requirements. You as an organization can then input your justification as to why you're using the control, how you implement it as a business, and these are free text boxes for you to enter in whatever information is pertinent to the assessment itself. From here, there are a couple of reports you can run. We have one that will allow you to run a report on just the control, which will highlight all of those drop-down menus that we've seen just a second ago. Or more importantly, you can run your statement of applicability. So if you're going for certification, you have essentially a one-for-all report. So this will include all of that information you've fed into it. So looking at 7.2.2, we have the requirement and what you as an organization are doing with that particular control set. So moving on from ISMS controls, we then move into the regulation or legal section. Under here, we will have the EU GDPR, UK laws, and as we've seen previously in the organizational controls, the way to upload your own regulations as well. So if you have other regulations to conform to, so whether that's financial, etc., they can be uploaded and referenced in exactly the same manner. If we look at the EU GDPR and pull this one up into view now, and expand on chapter 1, for example, if we just pull each one of these into view, we can very quickly see, if we look at Article 2 material scope, for example, expanding on this will then show you the requirements, source documentation, and how to implement it within the business. You'll then have its status, its effective from date and effective to. And then, as we saw a second ago when we were looking at the ISO 27001 control set and how they related to the legal requirements, we can see it vice versa. So we can see very clearly here that Article 2 material scope links directly to 5.1.1 of ISO 27001. And as we've seen beforehand, you'll then have all of the same tabs available to you, including related processes, risks, records, etc. Down the bottom here, you'll then be able to mark your compliant, or whether you're compliant, non-compliant, whether you're excluding it or not applicable. And from here, you can actually run a number of reports again. The more important one is actually to run the report on the regulations themselves. So if we select on here, we get a clause report to show the validity, the status, whether you're compliant with it or not, what clauses you might have in relationship with it, any related controls, contracts, tasks, assets, risks, processes, etc. Again, just highlighting each one of those drop-down tabs. So once we have gone through the regulation section, it then moves us on into processes. Now, processes is part of the data flow mapping tool and the DPIA, and I'll show you the clear differences in just a moment. But ultimately, what this area allows you to do is utilize the asset library we've created previously. It will then allow you to understand what processes you actually have in an organization. This is typically done by either sessions with the department heads or the process owners, predominantly done by an information manager or an ISO, for example. And you can then break them down into the groups. So what the tool will allow you to do is create groups based on whatever you need it to be, whether it's done by function of the business, departments, maybe it's done by certain process and types, is entirely up to you. Selected on create new, you can either add to your existing groups or you create a new group, just needs 3 lines of text and that's your group created. Once you've done this and you want to add to your existing group and select, it will take you through again a very uniformed manner in which you're going to conduct these. So regardless of who's working on the project, the outcome will always be the same. The title at the top here, the process owner. So this is free text, so it could be Jim, for example, it could be the CTO. It's entirely up to you how you want to outline that, whether it's by role or by name. And then it will take you through some other questions you will need to answer to create, to be able to build the report as filled out as possible. So for scope, purpose, and technical and organizational security measures, some of these might seem like alien points to actually highlight, but we have given you descriptions as to what you need to enter in this type of information. So the scope of a process describes the boundaries of what is being mapped. The process is the purpose, describes the organization's reasons for processing the data, and the last one's relatively self-explanatory. However, the point of Article 30 is to illustrate not only how you handle data, but what sort of security measures you have in place when you're doing so. As we go down a little bit further, you'll then be able to outline what you what your status is when you're looking at this process. Are you simply a processor? Are you a controller? Or are you even a third party? Once you go down a little bit further, you'll then need to enter in the controller's contact details and your representative. However, through the use of the settings menu, if you select as a controller, it will pull that information through for you. So if we look at a process map that we've used quite a few times previously, it's a client capture. Essentially, it's a very basic process, taking information from a data subject, manipulating it across our business to then essentially spit it out into some form of marketing campaign. What we're able to see here at the very beginning is relationships with controls that we might have in place on the process. So again, just concreting a little bit more of those technical and organizational measures we might have in place. We can see if there's any legal requirements that we have related to this process, contracts, tasks, etc., very similar to where we've seen previously. If we select onto the data flow map itself, it takes you into the overview of the process itself. So this is one that we've previously built. Yours don't always need to be this complex or complicated. If you have a very simple onboarding process for HR, keep it nice and simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't create work for yourselves. It just needs to very clearly illustrate how information moves. What we're able to illustrate in here is the information comes in, it's then split among multiple parts of the business. We've previously been dealing with a couple of customers that are wishing to know a little bit more about how we actually move information from one place to another and then showing that return of information. The way that we would suggest doing it inside the platform is by adding another data input. So if you have, for example, information going into, I believe the example we spoke about with a client was it went into a payroll system, so it would have been basic payment information, and then spits out different types of information, which would then be salary, for example. So you just illustrate that by showing a new data input going into a new asset, and then it will allow you to show multiple information coming back out the other side. The way you build the map is by adding a new asset or using from your existing library, and it's all drag and drop from the left-hand side here. The same goes for your data inputs and also the return of data to your data subjects as well. There's quick search functionality built in across the platform to allow you to work your way through the system a little bit quicker. And then we also have the building tools at the top here, so undo, redo, copy, paste, move tools, connection tools, etc. If we look at this very beginning point, so this is the first point of contact that we have from the client that's going to be giving us this information. We can outline what they are, so are they a data subject, data broker, whatever you want to call them. Again, it's a customizable setting in the settings menus. We can then give it its reference, and this is a free text box, followed by what information we're taking. So this will allow us to utilize the records that we have inside our record library, or you can create them fresh inside the platform. So if you are doing a workshop with department heads, this will be where you'll enter that key information to begin with. You have drop-down areas for your data subjects, customizable inside settings. The same goes for personal data items, sensitive data items, the lawful basis in which you take it on, or exceptions if you're dealing with special categories of data. If you're not too familiar with what one you are actually doing, if you select on the information icon next to each one, it will give you a breakdown as to what types of lawful basis there are, and it also does the same for processing special categories of data as well. So once we are showing information moving through, we can then outline how it moves, if there's any comments or special information we need to add on. And lastly, we can then outline if there's a data encryption taking place at this section as well. The information will then travel through multiple different areas of our business, and this is just all built by using the connection tool and illustrating, okay, we've now got that information. Do both bits go to this area of the business? If they don't, okay, we'll just remove one. We then have the method in which it's moved, the comments, and also data encryption as well. Lastly on here, and it's something that we highlighted at the very beginning, is the system will alert you to anything that is going outside of the EEA from your business. So if we select on here, actually we just change the location on the OneDrive to, let's say, another non-EEA state, so China, for example. If we select got it, what this line would have done is it will change to illustrate a bright red line with an exclamation point, which will then bring your attention to it to outline the third country transfer information. So do you have appropriate safeguards in place? Derogations apply? So is it standard data protection clauses? Is it approved code of conduct, etc., etc. Once the map has been created, you're then able to export your information into a report, or you can view it live inside the platform, so you're getting a bit of a build-up real time as you're going through and creating the process. As we scroll through the process map, we're starting to see some of that early information we entered in, so the controller's details. We then have the process overview, including the scope statements, purposes, etc., and summaries of the data being used. We then have the process map from a top-level view, the list of personal data inventories that we're going to be working with, so the types of data, how long we keep them for, a list of the data subjects, an asset register, including that core information, so where are the assets based, what are their descriptions, etc. And then as we go through a little bit further, we then come down to the meat and bones of the process. So whilst yes, it's all good and well having a top level view, we can then see the transfers themselves, so the methods, the data sources, what information there is actually being handled, where it's coming from and to, the encryption types, etc. So moving on from process maps, the segue naturally from there is then going to be conducting your DPIA itself. The way you would do this is by selecting on the icon next to the data flow map icon, and this is typically what your DPIA is going to look like. If you have just that module by itself, you won't have an overview of the process that you're wanting to do it with, but you can still conduct the DPIA all the same anyway. Down here, you'll then have sections 1 and 2, which is the process description and the screening questions. This is how the DPIA tool very quickly identifies if you need to conduct the complete assessment, or based on the responses you've given, that what you've told it is satisfactory. So if we select on this one, for example, process description, it will take you through standardized, again, uniformed questions directly in line with the GDPR's requirements, so specific articles, recitals, etc. And depending on how you answer them, so how many data subjects are involved, do you deal with vast numbers of countries inside the process, is it all automated through systems? If you answer yes to the majority of these types of things, it's then going to suggest you conduct the assessment itself. On the back, or just touching on the assessment, if you are then having to go through consultation, principal questionnaires, privacy risk assessments and reviews, a big part of that is going to be the privacy risk assessment itself. Inside here, what we're able to highlight are the assets in which we're conducting the assessment on. We can see what the threats and vulnerabilities are that we've highlighted and what the before and after treatment scores are. We can see how we treat them, and if we select on the edit icon, it will take you through, again, another standardized set of queries to go through, such as what asset does it relate to, the threat and vulnerability combinations. These are already pre-populated for the user. We can then go through and view the initial risk. So obviously based on your impact and likelihood scales that your initial scope would have set up. We then have the responses, the controls you might be using, the review, the residual risk, and then finally how you're going to finish the risk off by who actually owns it, and if there's any documentation or comments that you need to add on. If we close out of this section and cancel, the report that you'd be able to pull out of this for either stakeholders, senior management, for your own records, or for the ICO knocking on the door and asking for a bit more information, it will give you a full report on all of the queries that you'd have gone through and answered, so essentially they will see it also as a checklist. So if we now go back to our processes, which takes us back into the screen we looked at just a moment ago, and we're now going to move through the drop down here into risk assessments. Risk assessments are something you might want to just have for your own reference. It might also be for best practice. You don't have to do certification. It could just be just a way of you keeping an eye on your most common risks, both looking at privacy and also organizational as well. So if we are going to start a brand new assessment, the way we would do this is by selecting here, and we're just going to enter in today for webinar. These scales are going to be based on your scope that you had originally set up with your stakeholders, senior management, etc. internally. If you use different wording, this can all be customized as well. So if you want to change it, you're not stuck with cookie cutter drop-down menus. We select save on here. If you want to add additional context, sorry, excuse me, you might then also have percentages that you prefer to work with, or any other type of context that fits your needs. As we then go through, we then have impact on the organization. So is it very low all the way to very high? Do you use different wording? Not a problem. You can edit all of these fields. We can also do that for the CI and A. And if you need to add additional context here for financial, maybe it's going to be something for reputational, then you can choose to do that as well. Below there, you'll then have your criteria. So we tend to use traffic light systems. You can add your own criteria scoring if you want to, change coloration, the wording, where it stands on this grid as well. The last section is then going to be the impact on the rights and freedoms of your data subjects, ranging from, again, very low to very high, customizable text, and also customizable scales. Once you've created the assessment group, you can then start adding your risks into this. We've got three different ways you can do this. Asset class, as we mentioned earlier, the faster method and a lot broader. The individual asset, and also scenario based as well. If we pull our advisor mobile device into view and expand, we've got a quick overview of what the threat and vulnerability was that we identified. We can see the initial risk to the organization and the data subject, the response we've taken, and who owns it, very similar to what we saw when we were looking at the DPIAs. However, with this, we've then got a little bit more key information we can start relating back to. Are there any tasks related to it? What controls do we use on this risk? We can also select on here to say, okay, so we've used this control on this risk. If we select the information icon, we can then see here the requirement and also mark our implementation, or jump directly to the control itself, see if there's any related documentation to it, or we need to make amendments to how we implement it on this particular area. If we go into the risk assessment, the purpose again here is to keep it very conform, so it will look exactly the same as the DPIA, except this time it's going to have organizational risk and also data subjects. As we go through, again, you've got assets and asset classes that you can search through, your threat and vulnerability combinations, threats to the organization initially, and also to data subjects. The response you're going to take, so are you choosing to treat the risk, are you going to terminate the risk, are you going to tolerate it, or transfer it? You'll then have access to all of the controls inside the platform, so PCI DSS 27001, and also your own organizational controls if you've uploaded them. You've then got the ability to review that residual risk to the organization, to the data subjects, and as we saw earlier in the DPIA, the final sign-offs of the risk owner, if there's any messages or if there's any comments or documentation that needs to be linked to at this point as well. So from here, what we can run are risk reports, which will highlight all of that key information underneath the drop downs of the risk. So what the risk, threat and vulnerability combination was, the controls being used, tasks, etc. More importantly from here, though, you can run your risk treatment plans specific to that individual assessment group itself. So again, it's going to show what the type of treatments that we're taking, the ownership. The controls now are actually a little bit more detailed as well. So instead of saying, yes, these controls are in place, we can now very clearly see, okay, is it implemented or not? Are there tasks that relate to that control? What was the deadline that it needed to be completed by? And we can also see if there's any additional tasks to the risk itself. So who's the owner of that task? Has it been completed? And finally, its deadline as well. Moving on from risk assessments, we then move into the task area itself. The first one is breach reporting. So we previously touched on this at the beginning, where this might be related a bit more to, or historically to, the IT team. It typically was seen in that that they tend to deal with someone leaving their phone on the train, or something's gone missing, etc. So now it's a bit more of a collaborative manner. So yes, your IT team can still have access to this platform, but it's now going to be looked into from more of a data protection perspective, as opposed to, okay, they've lost a laptop. Did they have any key information? Have we managed to shut it down? Let's get another one set up for them. We're now looking into a little bit more detail. So again, that data protection by default and design, or by design and default, sorry. At the top here, it will take you through some standardized questions, and again, linking directly back to the certain articles that it's going to be relating to. So we can see here what happened. It's a general question. However, this time you can actually see that this is actually a pertinent part of Article 33.3. We can then see, was the breach caused by a cyber incident? We can then see when it happened, and the minute you do that, it will then assign the deadline in which you need to decide whether it's going to be reported or not. Below there, you'll then have your breach scope, so what categories of personal data were included, how many personal data records could be affected, etc. And again, linking back to those articles. We then come down into cyber instances. So has the CI&A been affected by this? Select all that apply, and again, it's linking back to the GDPR articles. Notifying the relevant parties. We then also come down to the last section of taking action. So how's the staff member involved in the breach received data protection training? What measures were in place to prevent the breach of this nature? And it's all about showing your work. So if you're ever queried by a governing body or an external body, you're able to illustrate that, yes, look, we understand that this breach occurred. This is the type of information that we'd gone through to understand what actually happened. And then this has actually helped us to improve our standards moving forward. Moving on from breaches comes into most people's bane of their lives at the moment is DSARs. They can either be disruptive, or it can just be a general customer saying, look, okay, I just want to know what information you've got of mine. Typically, we're finding at the moment that it is normally disgruntled ex-employees. They're just trying to have one last stand with their previous employer. They see it as a very good way of disrupting business, causing a lot of admin work that has to go into it. So the one way that we've tried to alleviate some of that pressure is by just keeping track of the assessment or the DSAR itself, not just going, okay, well, we know that David received the request last week, he's on holiday this week, we're not really too sure what's going on with it. Providing it was all loaded into our system, you'll be able to very quickly see that, okay, John Smith requested this on the 11th of June. The source of the request was the data subject, not a third party. We can see who owns it, we can see the status of it and the details that are included. Below there, we can then start to go through some standardized questions that the ICO will want you to be able to answer if they say, okay, well, can you show me what DSAR this was, or I've been asked by John Smith to understand what's taken you so long, why have you not tracked this properly? It also works in the other way as well. So if you are continuously being harassed by a particular person that needs to feel the need to keep putting DSARs through, for example, you can very clearly show them, look, we've had this same request 6 times now over a 4-month period. We can't offer more information. These are the very clear steps we've gone through. We've highlighted what processes they belong into, what risks might be related to it. We can see that we've complied with specific legal requirements. There's documentation that we're storing on here as well. We don't know what else more, we don't know what more we're able to provide. This will take you through some additional queries. And then lastly, once you've said that, yes, we've taken all this information, we've confirmed who the user is, let's say it was today, so the 13th of November, the system will then automatically put your deadline on there for that 1 calendar month point, and it will create a task visible both within here and also from organizational task overviews. So moving on from DSARs, we can then start looking at organizational tasks. Essentially, this is an overview of everything that's been set up, assigned, whether it's looking at retentions of a record, whether we're going to be looking at enter the data map, for example. We can see the deadlines, where they link back to who the ownership is as well. That's a shared commodity across all of the platforms. One that we're going to be looking at now is going to be third parties. So third parties are fantastic in some respects. If you're employing somebody to do something that you don't necessarily want to or don't have the ability to handle in-house, typically it can be outsourced call centers, it could be outsourced contractors, for example. Either way, you do need to keep track of them. What information are they taking of yours or handling of yours? Do you have the sort of steps in place to make sure that you're consistently reviewing this type of agreement between the two individuals as well? If we expand, it will give you the basic information of the deadline of when that third party is due to go live. You'll then also have who owns it in your business. So in my case, it's me. It could be your facilities manager if you're looking at contracting, for example, or CTOs, and then their address, email, phone, and description as well. Below there, you'll then have some standardized questions to go through. So have you requested information from the third party regarding the data protection practices? Has the third party provided you with the information about these? And according to their responses, does the third party meet your criteria? So whilst, yes, it's nice having those 3 questions on there just for your self satisfaction, we do also provide you with questionnaires. So if you are bringing on a third party to be a joint controller or a joint processor or a processor of your information, we've built you standard questionnaires you can quickly send out to them. They can complete. As soon as it's returned, you upload the file directly back into here, and then you can assign a task for this for, let's say, 6 months down the line, just to review if that's still the case. Most of you have probably seen this, most of you have probably done this, where you'll then go to a company that you've either got on a supplier list, for example, and say, can you just make sure everything's all correct and send it back to me? Everyone's had to fill one in, everyone's probably sent one out as well. The last couple of sections is going to be the gap analysis, which is part of the GDPR manager. So we mentioned at the very, very beginning that this is normally employed by a much smaller organization that maybe necessarily doesn't have the resource to go down the consultancy route, maybe is new to GDPR for whatever reason, maybe they're late to the game, maybe they're a brand new company and they're trying to get compliant as quickly as possible. This will take you through a staggering 333 questions. They're relatively very clear and easy to understand. They are in, we expand and just have a look at understanding the organization and its context, they're relatively self-explanatory. We've tried to make them as clear as possible. So has the organization determined any external and internal issues that could affect its ability to achieve the intended outcome of its personal information management system? So the questions themselves are very clear. We point to certain clauses within BS 10,012 and also the GDPR articles themselves. And then as you go through this, the tool will then start to understand, okay, that is a big tick in the box. You're absolutely fine on that section. And as you can see on mine, it is a dummy gap analysis, but ultimately it's able to highlight very quickly to me that, okay, we are absolutely fine on, let's say, about 60% of our business itself. Where we really need to focus our time, resource, even finances, is going to be planning. So if we expanded on here, it'll be actions to address risks and opportunities in general. You'll then also be able to highlight whether there needs to be improvements to your support, so control of documented information, creating and updating documentation. We can then go down into operational, so do we have fair, lawful and transparent processing for specific legitimate purposes, etc. And then lastly, it could just be improvements, so non-conformity and corrective actions. People that have done things like 27001 certification, or if you've been highlighted to the ICO, they've kind of looked at you and went, that's not quite right, and given you a slap on the wrist instead of a big fine this turnaround. It might have been something you had previously highlighted on, something like a gap analysis. The last tab on here, and again, it's a shared resource across your modules, will be the documentation library. Documentation library is helpful in a number of manners. If you are at the very early stages of 27001 and you've simply identified your gaps when you're looking at your controls, or if you're looking at just your general scoping, it's a very quick and easy way to keep them stored and work on the project moving forward. Alternatively, it's a very key way of, if you're looking at control implementation and you have policies and documents that support that, what you can do here is say, okay, we're looking at, we'll just pick the top one, for example. If we expand, we've got the link, classification, types, etc. So if we edit on here, it will tell us that we can't because it's actually part of another risk, or it's linked to something at the moment. If we go to create a new one though, what we can do here is say, okay, we want to upload a document so we can view it inside the platform, so we don't have to rely on a third party to send it to us, or we can link to an external area. So if you use SharePoint predominantly, it could be linked directly at that point. Or if you actually want to use this platform to build the document library from scratch, you can enter it all in manually. You can hyperlink here, enter tables, etc. You can then give the title, give the document its title, ascertain who the owner of this document is, so it'll be a user of the platform, whether they're read-only, whether they're an organization admin, whether they're contributors. We then have classifications, so this is again something you can customize in your settings, as well as the type. Again, it's a settings area that you can customize, so is it a policy, is it a procedure, is it a work instruction, or is it simply a record of information? Once you've entered all this, so if we just enter in some test information at this point, say on the owner, it's confidential and it's a procedure. Once we create this document, we then have it down the bottom, and what we can do is we can then start linking it to specific controls. So if we say yes, we want to add a control here, it will then bring up a pop-up box here which will give you access to all of the control sets. We're going to say very quickly that yes, it links directly to 5.1.1. It's the supporting document that goes with this. We can also say yes, does it link to a specific legal requirement? Does it support a contract? Is it applicable to an asset? That can all be referenced at this point. So from there, we will return back to our dashboard. The other last couple of points that we will cover off is the dashboard is completely live. So instead of using the drop-down menu, you can very quickly jump to any area using the hyperlinks. Some areas allow you to expand again. So if you're presenting this to upper management, they just want to see a little bit more information without being bamboozled by too much information. Selecting on load more just allows you to bring a little bit more into view. So it'll just start to highlight some of the higher risks. If they just want to say, we're not bothered about all of the control sets, we just want to know 27001, we can do that. The same goes for the legal requirements sections. So a lot of the tabs are actually live in the way that they can just be manipulated there and then without having to refresh and log into other sections. So that brings me to the end of going through the actual platform itself. The other sections that we would predominantly go through are reserved more for support calls or anything like that. So From our side here, we'd like to thank you all for attending this afternoon. We hope it's given you some sort of insight as to how it might help with the project, how it might assist with 27001 implementation, getting to understand and know maybe certain regulation points, allowing you to know that, okay, if we're doing this, we can actually upload documents here, so we're not having to do it in 3 different places, for example, and ultimately how CyberComply can help a team that is at times potentially disjointed or reliant on one person more than the other. Using a system like this allows you to work in that collaborative manner, so it doesn't matter if someone's off, you'll still have access to that information. It doesn't matter if there's a new person starting implementation and onboarding, that person is very quick, both from a support perspective and also from you getting them up and running, and whatever they continue to do moving forward will be exactly the same as it used to be previously, so you're not going to have a break in continuity as to how that workflow is going to continue. So as the slide indicated a little bit earlier on, we will now go into a Q&A session. We've got a couple more minutes on the webinar before we'll end. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, the sessions are recorded shortly afterward the meeting. As soon as the video has been rendered, we'll then be able to share it with you via a link, so you're not having to download anything all in one go. The slides from the presentation will also be included, and there'll also be contact information on the very last slide, which will then take you into the different support channels, the different websites you can go to for assistance. We have FAQ pages, and also just some general white paper, brochure documents, etc., that you'll be able to utilize moving forward as well. So we will finish on our Q&A page, and whilst we're waiting for that to come through, or any questions to come through, we will leave some general contact information on the screen there for you. But again, thank you all very much for your time this afternoon, and I look forward to speaking to you in the near future.